Okay, up until this point, we've been painting with solid colors here inside Photoshop. What if I wanted to start using gradients inside my artwork? Now, what's a gradient? Well, if you're not sure, a gradient is simply a transition between multiple colors, at least two colors or more. So, for example, I could create a gradient that transitions between red and blue, for example. Or I could create a gradient that transitions between red, blue, green, and yellow, whatever I want. I can use Photoshop's preset gradients if I wanted to, or I can go about creating my own custom gradients, depending on what it is I'm trying to pull off. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples of working with gradients inside Photoshop, and then we'll actually apply a gradient to our robot cartoon here. So I'm going to hit Control-0 on my keyboard here to zoom all the way out, and then I'm going to switch to an unlikely tool here, my rectangular marquee tool, way up in the top of my toolbox. And then with this guy selected, go ahead and create for yourself a selection over on the side of your canvas. We have lots of room on the sides of your canvas there, so go ahead and create some kind of a selection and then zoom in on that selection. I'm just holding down Control Spacebar here on the Windows side, or of course Command Spacebar on the Mac. Next, hit the G key on your keyboard. That should switch you to the gradient tool in your toolbox. If it doesn't, if it switches you to the paint bucket tool, just make sure to click and hold on the paint bucket tool and choose gradient tool. Great, good stuff. Now, inside the marching ants here on your canvas, all you have to do is click and drag with your tool, and you should get some kind of a transition. Maybe something like this, maybe something a little bit different. Now, what's controlling my gradient? How come it starts in sort of this dark magenta color and then transitions all the way down to sort of this grayish color? Well, for myself anyway, it relates to the two color swatches down at the bottom of the toolbox, my foreground and background colors. I'm going to go up to the options bar up at the top of the Photoshop interface and click on this little drop down, and I happen to be set on the very first gradient swatch, this guy here, which says foreground to background. Now I could switch this. I could set it to foreground to transparent or foreground to nothing, or I could use any of the other pre-created swatches. For example, I'll try orange, yellow, orange. I'll just single click on them there and then hit enter on my keyboard, and then back to my marching ants, all I have to do is click and drag. That's all there is to it, and I get this sort of effect happening here. Now, when you're working with your gradients inside Photoshop, you could click and drag out a fairly large gradient. In other words, I could start way out beyond my marching ants and click and drag way past my marching ants, something like that. Or what I could do is I could start within my marching ants and only drag a short distance and get something like this. I can drag on angles, I can drag straight up and down, I could drag right across from the left to the right. If I wanted to make sure my gradient was perfectly straight, I could hold down Shift as I drag, either horizontally or vertically, and get this sort of an effect. So you're going to have to experiment a little bit with your gradients to see what sorts of effects you can create inside Photoshop. Further, you can use these buttons up on the control bar. Rather than using a linear gradient, I could switch to a radial gradient, for example, and get something like this. Or I could switch to an angle gradient if I want and get this sort of a result, sort of a cone shape there. Again, you'll have to experiment and see what options you have available. I'm going to switch back to a linear gradient, and I'm going to go back to my gradient drop-down here. Again, you could choose any of the predefined gradients inside this drop-down. Instead, though, I want to load in one of Photoshop's preset gradient swatch libraries. So I'm going to go up to this little menu way up at the top of this gradient drop-down, and down at the bottom of this menu, I'll find all of the preset gradient libraries. So, for example, I could choose simple or pastels, or I'm going to choose special effects here. And just like my swatches, I'm going to get this dialog box coming up asking me if I want to add the new gradient swatches onto the current set of swatches, or if I simply want to load them all in. I'm going to click on OK, and that will load them all in. There's my special effects here. And again, choose a swatch here, hit enter, and then try it out on your canvas, something like that. Okay, now you don't have to stick with Photoshop's preset gradients. You can go and create your own very easily using something called the gradient editor. All I'm going to do is single click on this little gradient swatch that I see up on the options bar, and that brings me into the gradient editor. Down at the bottom, I can see my gradient ramp, and I can grab these little guys here. These are called color stops, and I can drag them along the ramp here to adjust the gradient if I like, to set up the distance between my colors. I can grab these little diamonds if I want to increase or decrease the fade between the colors. Or, you know, I could change the colors completely if I wanted to. I've grabbed one of my color stops here, If I double click on it, that brings me into Photoshop's color picker window. We were just here not too long ago. And I could go and choose a color. So I'm going to set up a gradient that transitions between some yellows and reds and oranges. So I'll go and find a yellow. I'll click on OK. That gets loaded in there. I'll double click on the next color stop. Go down and find a reddish color here, maybe a scarlet. Looks good. And I'll do my last guy here. Find an orange in here that we can use. Maybe something like that. Okay, great. Good stuff. So there's my new burst, my new gradient that I've created. Now, down in the bottom here, I'm going to click on New. That adds in my gradient, so now I've saved it. I'm going to click on OK. And, of course, my gradient gets set up on the options bar, so I could go and use him here inside Photoshop. But I've got a plan for this guy. I want to use this guy inside my artwork. So, as a matter of fact, I'm going to hit Delete on the keyboard to clear out all of my gradients. And I'll deselect just by hitting Control-D on my keyboard. And I'm going to hold down the spacebar and pan all the way up to this robot's word bubble here, where he's saying, "So human, what will it be?" I've actually created a selection for this guy already, so all we have to do is load the selection in and then use our new gradient on it. So I'm going to head all the way up to the Select menu and down to Load Selection. The channel that I'm going to load in is called Word Bubble. There he is there. I'll click on OK. There, I see some marching ants inside my word bubble. Now, experiment. You could click and drag straight up and down if you like to get this sort of an effect. Or click and drag from the center to the outside to create something like that. Or you could try a radial gradient if you wanted to create something like this. You'll have to experiment and see what you like. I'm going to go back to my linear gradient. I kind of liked what I had to begin with. Something like that. So there you go. There's working with gradients inside Photoshop.